After Crowley had joined several occult societies, he found a way to separate himself from the hierarchy found in any religious and satanic order when his wife, Rose Kelly, who was in a hashish-induced trance at the time, ordered him to go to a temple that he had constructed in his apartment while they were visiting Cairo, Egypt in 1904. Here he heard a man's voice which dictated to him. Crowley had claimed to have written down every single word that voice had said, which then became a book, the Book of the Law. This book then became the central text of the Thelema, a spiritual philosophy followed by all members of the Ordo Templi Orientis, OTO. It is this book that is the basis of an occult ritual that Parsons saw for the first time and would influence him for the rest of his life. A book that would create two worlds for Jack Parsons that would inevitably lead these two worlds to collide. As for Rose Kelly's hashish-induced trance at the time, drugs would play a prominent role with Crowley, and it is said that Parsons too, which eventually led to Crowley's having a serious addiction to both drugs and alcohol later in life. However, there appears to be no evidence of Parsons using drugs when involved in the serious issue of rocket science, which indicates that he limited his use of any drugs to occult rituals. Ordo Templi Orientis. Parsons was soon to be introduced to Wilfred Talbot Smith by another scientist whose identity is unknown. But it would seem Parsons was not the only scientist at Caltech with some connection to Crowley's Ordo Templi Orientis, OTO. Smith was Crowley's representative in Los Angeles who introduced Parsons to Crowley's mystic order, the OTO. This was the only OTO order in Los Angeles, and in another of many coincidences, it was located only a few miles from Parsons' own house. There are many aspects of satanic rituals which people find disturbing, which were now a routine part of Parsons' life. Author John Carter says, "This enigmatic fusion of sex and rockets was to prove a fascinating development in the history of the aerospace industry in America. In yet another interesting coincidence, Parsons happened to meet L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of the Church of Scientology, which needs no introduction considering its connection to Hollywood and the numerous stories that are so often sensationalized in the media. And as is typical of Parsons' supposed vulnerability, Hubbard too had a major influence on him. And in one of many letters Parsons had written to Crowley, whom he referred to as Most Beloved Father, he explained his friendship with Hubbard, saying that he is the most thelemic person he had ever met. Wikipedia states, "Within the modern system of thelema developed by occultist Aleister Crowley in the first half of the 20th century, thelemic mysticism is a complex mystical path designed to do two interrelated things: to learn one's unique true will, and to achieve union with the All." Aleister Crowley's work is now being taken seriously by historians, so there is plenty of literature in books and online for those of you interested in Aleister Crowley's influence on celebrities and the power elite. Jack Parsons' worlds collide. In 1944, both Parsons and Foreman were forced to sell their stock in JPL. This eventually led to Parsons being ostracized by the scientific community, even though the rocket industry was now being taken seriously, and more so by the military-industrial complex. In their world, there was just no room for the unorthodox style of a scientist who lacked the formal education of an academic, despite the fact that Parsons' innovation and insightfulness brought solutions which are still in use today. Pendle writes, "At the age of 30, Parsons was cut adrift from the world of rocketry for the first time in his adult life. Like Goddard before him, he was left behind as the very science he had helped to create soared up and away from him. This led to Parsons' deeper involvement into the occult and his increased use of black magic. This greatly disturbed Crowley, who saw black magic as nonsensical. Instead, Crowley preferred his own form of magic to be used for mental and mystical development. Parsons, however, saw it differently and preferred the version put forward by the media, that of evil rather than good. This shows another aspect to Parsons, where he seems to have chosen a deliberate path to evil, which could be interpreted by many as a disdain for humanity. However, given the complexity of a man like Parsons, one can never be too sure as to what the path he chose meant for him. But as we will learn from this video series, this was but one step in technology on a road to discovery for future generations to build on and expanding an industry that should have flourished regardless of the cost. Instead, this has led to a roadblock in the aerospace industry that has been felt for decades and will most likely continue for decades more. An industry that has not progressed much further in technologies in terms of its rocket propulsion systems since the early 20th century for military and commercial use. It's akin to the aviation industry going no further than single-pilot, propeller-driven aircraft. As with the unmanned and manned space programs, the continuous use of 20th century propulsion systems are still in use. For example, Russia, which at least has managed to maintain a consistent capability of launching manned missions to LEO. The claim of limited funding is often used as an excuse by proponents for the lack of progress in the manned space program. However, all anyone has to do is follow NASA's funding to see that billions of dollars could easily have been prioritized for its manned space program. Yet, from 2011 on, NASA has spent billions of dollars funding unmanned missions and maintaining the International Space Station while they neglected their own means of getting their astronauts to it, relying instead on the Russian manned space program to do it for them. Given NASA's claim of superiority in the manned space program, one would expect that they would have had a workable manned spacecraft ready for launch after the Space Shuttle was retired. Jack Parsons' theory and work is credited with those propulsion systems still in use, a first step that now has been forever assigned its priority place in history, regardless of the fact that today NASA has not been able to build on this technology. This is apparent not only with its decision to fake the Apollo moon missions, but for the fact that for 30 years their manned space program, i.e. the Space Shuttle, went no further than LEO. Yet from 1961 to 1969, NASA claimed to have designed and engineered spacecraft and accomplished manned lunar landings. In the same time period from 2011, NASA managed to launch only one manned mission to the ISS with the SpaceX Falcon 9 and Dragon spacecraft on November 15, 2020. A counter-argument to this is that previous to NASA, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, founded in 1915 leading up to NASA, which was established in 1958, had actually been gathering data that was then incorporated into the relatively new aerospace industry and, of course, for the Apollo moon mission program. So the proponents say NASA has decades of data to access, so the timeline of 8 years to land men on the moon is misleading. However, the goal of NACA was to collect data for the aeronautical industry that already existed for an environment that mankind was more than familiar with. The manned space program required data for an environment never before experienced by mankind, so in essence, NASA had little or no data for the hostile environment in which they planned on sending manned missions through. Therefore, the real timeline was closer to 8 years for which they needed to collect data for a hostile environment to design and engineer spacecraft capable of sending manned missions to LEO, landing and lifting off from the lunar surface, traveling back safely to Earth, and for re-entry and a splashdown in the Pacific Ocean. NASA had never been able to duplicate its own claim of technological prowess in such a short timeline since. As for writing about Parsons' world of the occult, the point is to once and for all break the myth that somehow scientists are immune to some of the influences of our respective societies, when in actuality they are subject to the same desires, competitiveness, spiritual beliefs, likes, dislikes, jealousies, egos, and many of the other human traits that make us who we are. And in the aerospace industry, these traits are more common than most people know, Parsons being one example. This, along with Parsons' deep involvement in the occult, is the foundation in which JPL was formed, which leads a straight path to NASA. Although this had been reported in other sources, I gained more insight from my research into Parsons and Foreman's numerous contacts with Wernher von Braun before World War II. Pendle quotes from Ed Foreman's third wife. Both of the boys had talked to von Braun many times by telephone way before he ever came to the US. They were crazy about von Braun, and he was crazy about them because they were out horsing around with the same stuff. Jack Parsons' contact with Wernher von Braun before and possibly even during World War II makes one wonder what else had been left out of the history books regarding von Braun and any other contacts that he may have had with the American officials before he surrendered to American military forces in 1945. This raises serious questions as to how the FBI either missed the correspondence with the known Nazi before and possibly during World War II, or they knew about it and for some reason they weren't overly concerned. Further, it is now rumored that Parsons may have even met von Braun after he was brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip. Parsons' ongoing contact with von Braun before and possibly during World War II is yet another of many coincidences that we have seen with Parsons in both his world by day and his world by night. And although Parsons' contact with von Braun may appear to have been innocent, it's a stretch to believe that American intelligence agencies didn't know about this. A more likely scenario is that the American intelligence agencies did know and were collecting intel, possibly through others, along with Parsons. This more indicates that Parsons was in some capacity an intelligence agent. Either way, it seems von Braun had at least indirect connections to the American intelligence agencies before and during World War II, which have not yet been fully disclosed. However, one undeniable fact is clear. Jack Whiteside Parsons' legacy in the aerospace industry has now secured its proper place in history. The pre-Apollo moon missions. Part 1 of this series described and analyzed the Apollo 11 mission that supposedly journeyed to the moon and back. It described how 1960s technology would have been inadequate for a manned moon mission, for example, the inability of the F-1 engines of the Saturn V to use their full power capacity because of combustion chamber instabilities. And without the F-1 engines in the first stage of the Saturn V working at full power capacity, Apollo 11 could not have reached its optimum altitude 2 minutes after launch, where the first stage would have been jettisoned. After the jettison of the first stage, and regardless of the fact that the Saturn V's J2 engines in the second stage apparently ignited and worked perfectly, Apollo 11 was still lower in altitude 2 minutes after launch. This means that Apollo 11 could not have reached optimum orbit necessary for its eventual translunar ejection, no matter how perfectly the J2 engines functioned. If a contingency was worked out to have the J2 engines burn longer to compensate for a lower than planned altitude after launch, then more propellant would have been needed. But because of weight restrictions, propellant was limited to what was originally planned for in terms of the Saturn V trajectory on launch. This would have prevented any contingency for a further burn duration of the J2 engines in the Saturn V. Further, since the F-1 engines were not capable of using their full power capacity, or they weren't even used at all, Apollo 11 and subsequent Apollo missions could not have launched the necessary payloads into LEO necessary for manned lunar landings. We also described in Part 1 the impossibility of a mission like Apollo 11 to have safely traveled through the Van Allen belts due to the intense radiation as well as other hazardous elements like solar particle events, galactic cosmic rays, the problem of thermal control, and micrometeoroid impacts. As has been established, any one of these elements would have ended any Apollo mission. However, the more aspects of the Apollo 11 missions that are analyzed, and by inference that includes all of the Apollo missions, the more we counter NASA's claims that 6 of these missions landed safely on the lunar surface. The manned missions. In the first video series, I mentioned that NASA had 2 manned space programs leading up to the Apollo missions. But some say that there were actually 3 manned space programs leading up to the Apollo missions. So it's worth clarifying the discrepancy as to the number of manned space programs during the 1960s. Since the United States defines the boundary of space as being over 50 miles, the first American to have technically reached space was Air Force test pilot Michael White when he reached an altitude of 59.6 miles with the X-15, which was a rocket-propelled aircraft. However, the internationally accepted boundary of space is the Kármán line at 62 miles, which means that White is only recognized as the first American astronaut within the United States. Since the X-15 reached just beyond the boundary layer of space, which means the pilots would have experienced weightlessness, then technically it is considered one of the 3 manned space mission programs whose objectives were to collect data for future manned space missions. But the international community only recognizes Project Mercury and Project Gemini as the first 2 manned space missions. This is what has caused the discrepancy in manned space missions. We will not be including the X-15 as a manned space program, since this was a rocket-powered aircraft and not a spacecraft. So, referring specifically to the pre-Apollo manned missions, we will only involve the Mercury and Gemini missions. But it is well worth mentioning that the X-15 program, for its contribution to the data it collected for the overall space program, which is still being evaluated decades later. The X-15 program. The X-15 flew from 1959 to 1968. It was launched under the wing of a B-52 at 45,000 feet, which then fired its rocket engine and flew to an altitude of over 50 miles, the boundary layer of space. Each mission would last approximately 10 minutes and then land at Edwards Air Force Base. The main purpose of these missions was to gain data on the re-entry into Earth's atmosphere for the American space program. Re-entry procedures will be discussed in detail later on in this video series. However, another aspect gained from the X-15 program and its most enduring legacy was the importance of designing more sophisticated simulators capable of duplicating flight conditions for the aviation and aerospace industries. This too would greatly enhance training for both pilots and astronauts. This also started the debate regarding manual versus automation, which, as we will soon learn, was an ongoing debate within the manned space program. The X-15 made a substantial contribution to re-entry procedures. This involved corrective control during re-entry using a vehicle with the aerodynamic design of an aircraft. However, NASA had decided on the capsule concept for its manned space missions in the 1960s, so we will focus instead on that concept and design when discussing re-entry into Earth's atmosphere, which had little or no corrective control abilities. Project Mercury. There were 6 manned missions for Project Mercury from 1961 to 1963. These were 1 manned spacecraft, which were the first American spacecraft to reach LEO. These missions had an apogee of no more than 176 miles and a perigee of 100 miles. The goal of the Mercury program was straightforward. 1. To send astronauts into LEO, and 2. Practice re-entry into Earth's atmosphere and eventually splashdown in the Atlantic or Pacific Oceans. Therefore, the Mercury program had met its objectives. However, the issue of manned versus automation was brought to the forefront of the discussion, which had caused a fierce debate among many of the astronauts who objected just to being passengers in the Mercury spacecraft. As John Glenn told a press conference soon after his selection to the Mercury team, "We don't want to just sit there and be like a passenger aboard this thing. We will be working the controls." Nevertheless, the automatic as primary approach would survive through the Apollo program. It is interesting to note that Buzz Aldrin had been heard to repeat a similar theme when he was questioned decades later about the validity of the Apollo missions, saying that they were just passengers, although given what we know now, this definitely has more than one meaning. Project Gemini. Project Gemini consisted of 10 manned missions which were regarded as being a step forward in progress in terms of astronaut participation as opposed to just being monitors or passengers of the spacecraft. However, the issue of manual versus automation would continue, even more so, when it came to accomplishing the objectives of these missions. The objectives of the Gemini missions were designed specifically to practice maneuvers in LEO for the upcoming Apollo moon missions. These objectives included long-duration missions, rendezvous and docking, extravehicular activities, and precision landings. It was planned that after the Gemini spacecraft re-entered the atmosphere, it would then deploy a parachute on the last several thousand feet of its descent, and the astronauts would then hand-fly their spacecraft with skids deployed to a precision landing on a runway. However, because of technical and funding issues, it was decided instead to continue with the method of splashdown in the ocean, which was used for all manned missions in the 1960s and 70s. Note: lack of funding issues is an overall theme regarding the manned space program. However, a more realistic reason for the claim that there was a lack of funding may have more to do with the realization that Congress knew much more about the impracticality of manned missions to LEO. Further, Congress may have known too of the impossibility of manned missions beyond LEO using present technologies. However, NASA still gets on an average of about $20 billion per year. Therefore, they could easily prioritize its fundings for a manned spacecraft launch capability to LEO if they choose to. As to why they don't, has little or nothing to do with the claim of not being provided adequate funding. One major component of both the Gemini and Apollo missions was that of rendezvous and docking, where the need for automation was made even more apparent. Although NASA claims that the Gemini 3 demonstrated manual maneuvers quite successfully, astronaut Jim McDivitt tried unsuccessfully to rendezvous with a spent booster during the Gemini 4 mission. He realized that piloting skills alone were inadequate for rendezvous. In fact, there were those within NASA who would go as far as to question any need for flying skills at all as a requirement for astronauts. Afterward, McDivitt attributed the problem to poor lighting, but he was faced with something new. Orbital dynamics created a strange brew of velocity, speed, and range between two objects, and calling for a new kind of piloting. Catching up to a spacecraft ahead, for example, might actually require flying slower to change orbit. It's a hard thing to learn, observed Deke Slayton, since it's kind of backwards from anything that you know as a pilot. A NASA investigation concluded that training had been inadequate and that the entire program had undetermined the subtlety for a rendezvous task. Gemini 4 taught an important lesson. Pilots could not rendezvous by eye. Deke Slayton was a World War II pilot and aeronautical engineer. He was also a test pilot who was selected as an astronaut for the Mercury program but was disqualified due to a medical problem. He was then made chief of the astronaut office and director of flight crew operations, responsible for NASA crew assignments for both the Gemini and the Apollo programs. By 1972, Slayton had resolved his health problems and returned to flight status. He was one of the astronauts on the Apollo-Soyuz mission. One would assume that NASA was fully aware of these new orbital dynamics and would have known about the problems of using manual techniques for rendezvous before attempting any manned mission. And aside from any claims of some of the Mercury and Gemini astronauts' piloting skills were increasingly becoming less of a prerequisite, while the need for a fully automated and autonomous computer would become necessary. And as we see in the previous quote, astronauts could not rendezvous manually. The issue of manned versus automation will figure prominently when discussing this later in the video series. However, with the Gemini program, NASA claimed to have found a way to appease both the astronauts and the engineers by adopting more of a hybrid method, i.e., having the astronauts participate by interfacing with the onboard computer for many of the programs involved in manned space missions. Manual and automation would coexist, for now that is. Or put another way, astronauts' piloting skills were to be seen more of a necessary component that would enhance any success for manned missions, especially when landing on the lunar surface. In essence, NASA needed to build on a heroic fighter pilot image to sell the official narrative to the public, which in turn would solicit the necessary emotional response. This was apparent in the official narrative for the Apollo 11 lunar landing. The unmanned missions. In 1961, NASA implemented a program to use unmanned spacecraft to collect data for the Apollo moon landings. There were 4 different types of spacecraft designed and built called Ranger, Lunar Orbiter, Surveyor, and Pegasus. The Pegasus missions were designed to record micrometeoroid impacts, which posed a very real threat to any of the Apollo missions. However, these missions were no further than Earth orbit. The Pegasus missions were discussed in Part 1 of this series. The Ranger Program. The Ranger Program took place between 1961 to 1964. The purpose of these missions was to take the first ever close-up images of the surface of the Moon, then impact to the lunar surface after each mission had met their objective. However, there were serious problems encountered with these missions, so NASA did not achieve the overall objective of the program. There were 9 missions in all. Ranger 1 experienced numerous problems after launch. Among them, radio interference prevented ground-based tracking systems from properly tracking the mission, and further, it did not enter an elliptical orbit after the Agena rocket engine failed to reignite its engine for its mission. Ranger 1 re-entered Earth's atmosphere several days later. Ranger 2 had similar problems after launch when its Agena rocket failed to reignite for its mission, and it too entered Earth's atmosphere several days later. Ranger 3 actually made it out of LEO and was on course to impact to the lunar surface until its downlink to ground-based tracking systems failed, causing the vehicle to enter solar orbit, which meant a loss for the mission. Ranger 4 was on its way to impact to the lunar surface when it tumbled out of control during separation from its spent stage and impacted the far side of the Moon, therefore it never accomplished its objective. Ranger 5 lost its downlink to ground-based tracking stations, apparently to loss of battery power. It then entered solar orbit, therefore ending its mission. Ranger 6 had managed to successfully impact to the lunar surface, but it failed to take any photos, so it too did not meet its objective. Rangers 7, 8, and 9 had met their objectives in sending back photos of the lunar surface before impact, classifying these 3 missions as a success. The images taken by Rangers 7, 8, and 9 enabled the U.S. Geological Survey to make plaster models of the lunar surface for study. This is an important point to remember when discussing the simulation aspect and how NASA used these lunar surface models in simulations, which were a necessary component in faking the Apollo missions. These simulations will be discussed further on in this series. The Lunar Orbiter Program. There were 5 lunar orbiter missions launched between 1966 and 1967. 1 were lunar orbiters 1, 2, and 3, which photographed potential landing sites for the Apollo missions. Lunar orbiters 4 and 5 photographed the entire lunar surface. These landing sites were chosen using Earth-based observations, but the lunar orbiters were used to get more detailed photos of the areas selected. Considerations for the landing sites included smoothness of the terrain, numbers of craters, hills, and cliffs in the surrounding areas, the amount of propellant needed for the LM aspect of the mission, and a free return trajectory for any of the Apollo missions should it be required due to failure of the service propulsion system. Note, a free run trajectory meant that if any of the Apollo missions experienced engine failure on the way to the Moon, they would have been able to coast around the Moon and back to Earth, in theory that is. However, that was changed after Apollo 11 in favor of a hybrid trajectory supposedly due to NASA's increased confidence in the CSM propulsion system. This meant that the missions would start out on a free-run trajectory and then would perform a mid-course maneuver for a more precision in their approach to the landing site, given up the free-run trajectory. For those who believe the official version of the Apollo missions, one should wonder why this confidence was maintained after the near-alleged disaster of the Apollo 13 mission. Micrometeoroid impacts were done on each of the 5 unmanned spacecraft. Each of them carried 20 detectors to record micrometeoroid impacts. The spacecraft flew equatorial and polar orbits around the Moon. Their orbits ranged from approximately 20 to 3,900 miles. Micrometeoroid data was collected for 17 months. The 5 orbiters recorded 22 punctures during that time area exposure of 130 square meters per day. These figures gave an average rate of 0.16 puncture per square meters per day in the near-lunar environment, or about 1/2 of the average rate of flux recorded by the Earth-orbiting satellites Explorer 16 and Explorer 23. The 5 lunar orbiters recorded approximately 22 micrometeoroid impacts per day according to what is documented, and the impacts were greater near the lunar surface. However, there is no mention of any damage to the detectors themselves on these unmanned missions, which leaves one to guess as to how many detectors were actually working during that 17-month period. Hence, the number of micrometeoroid impacts recorded per day has to be considered a conservative estimate, to say the least. Micrometeoroids would have posed a serious risk to any Apollo mission, especially the LM. As documented in Part 1, the LM walls had a thickness equivalent to 3 layers of kitchen foil, which needs no explanation as to the lack of protection for the astronauts. Either a micrometeoroid impact or an astronaut putting his foot through one of the LM walls would have ended the mission instantly. And given some of the carelessness of these astronauts while allegedly walking on the lunar surface, causing them to fall over several times and risking tearing their spacesuits, accidentally putting one's foot through the LM wall was not out of the realm of possibilities. Radiation experiments were conducted by each of the lunar orbiters too. Each lunar orbiter had 2 cesium iodide detectors on board. The data obtained from the radiation experiments on board the 5 lunar orbiter spacecraft had significant implications for the Apollo program. What would be the approximate doses of radiation experienced by the astronauts in spacesuits, in the lunar module, in the Apollo command module? To obtain an answer, the primary investigator Dr. Trutz Fulsche by the 2 cesium iodine detectors in each of the 5 orbiters. One of the 2 was shielded by 0.2 grams of aluminum per square centimeter, the other by 2 grams of aluminum per square centimeter. Because of the higher absorption of the protons and alpha particles per gram per square centimeter in soft tissue of water, the doses recorded by the lunar orbiter dosimeters had to be multiplied by 2. The analysis showed that all the events recorded were of significance to a man in space only where shielding was light, specifically in a spacesuit or in the lunar module. This is a very interesting and revealing quote from NASA, given the lack of shielding for the Apollo missions, especially the LM, which this quote makes very clear. It substantiates researchers' claims that radiation in space would be hazardous to any of the Apollo manned missions outside of LEO, given the level of protection that they had, or lack thereof. NASA then compared the data from Pioneer 5, launched in 1960, to the data from Pioneer 6, launched in 1965, with that of the lunar orbiter. Both Pioneer missions recorded data from the SPEs, and after they reviewed the data from both the Pioneer and lunar orbiter missions, their conclusion was both startling and clear. From these data, the inference could be made that in rare cases of large event groups, such as those of 1959 and 1960, the Apollo astronauts might have experienced skin doses greater than 1,800 to 5,000 rads in 1 week if no precautions were taken. Doses of 200 to 1,000 rads in a few hours will cause serious illness. Any dose beyond 1,000 means a quick end to a manned mission outside of the relative protection of the Earth's magnetic field. Further, as was explained in Part 1, NASA did not have the capability of recording the true radiation flux, so this data supplied by NASA must be taken with caution.